All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this month's Cyber Showcase. I'm your host, Brett Rock, a business development manager or business development product specialist, rather, here with SBS Cybersecurity. I've also got with me today somebody who needs no introduction whatsoever, but I'm going to allow him to make one anyway. John Waldman, our president and partner with the company. So, John, you want to say hi?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, friends. Glad to have you guys join us today to talk a little bit about the NIST cybersecurity framework, a topic that we've been spending a lot of time on here at SBS since February. So I am at your disposal, my friend.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, John. We appreciate that as well. As John alluded to, our topic today is what's new with NIST. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the National Institute of Standards and Technology and probably very familiar with that. They just released kind of the second iteration of their cybersecurity framework, I guess probably a few weeks ago now. And so our goal for today is pretty simple. We're going to have a conversation about where NIST started, what the cybersecurity framework is, what the biggest changes were. And then we're going to jump into some new offerings that SBS is rolling out. We're very excited about that. We think we'll be able to help anybody who is using or has adopted that framework in order to better themselves going forward. So we've got some exciting things there as well. Just quickly, there are our names and faces, also our contact information. I'm sure I speak for John when I say if you have any questions or comments or anything you want to follow up with us on afterward, feel free to use our contact information there. From an agenda perspective, we're going through the introductions and the agenda as we speak. We're going to talk real quick about what's coming up from SBS. We're going to jump into NIST itself. What is it? What the CSF is? Why it's so popular? Then we'll jump into 2.0, some of the changes, how that's going to impact you potentially, and also what the future might look like as well. I'm going to ask John to look in his crystal ball there. And then we'll wrap things up today by talking about those new services I mentioned, and hopefully have some time for some Q&A as well. So lots to get to, but very excited to have a conversation with you all here today. So just quickly, for those of you who might not be familiar with us, or if anybody who just needs a refresher, SBS Cybersecurity, we have been in the industry for 20 years now. We actually celebrated the Big 2.0 earlier this year. Very excited about that. With somebody who was here right from the start, obviously, so that's exciting as well. We've got all kinds of different things that we're excited to talk about, including that we were recently ranked #1 for cybersecurity consulting by G2. That's a website that aggregates reviews of our services and compares us to other firms that are out there. I'm hopeful all familiar with our educational offerings, and then all our team of highly qualified industry certified experts, including John himself. So with that said, just a couple of things about what's coming from us. You're probably also aware that we've been rolling out some SBS Institute webinars that John's been very much a part of. We've got 2 that are coming up here in the next month or 2 that are very exciting. John Helland on our team will be covering multi-factor authentication, what MFA is, why it's important, the different types, risks, threats, how to deploy it, how to test it, all those sorts of things. That's on May 15th of this year. And then June 20th, we will be having an information security professionals panel discussion where a team will be talking about the biggest cyber threats, biggest lessons learned from 2023, projects for 2024 and beyond, and then kind of an open forum for questions and discussion. So, John, I know you've been very involved in all of the planning for those webinars. I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't give you an opportunity to just maybe highlight 1 or 2 things you're excited about those that are coming up.
Absolutely. Yeah, we launched our own version of a webinar channel last July, right around, I think you were recently talking, Brett, about the new joint third-party risk management guidance. So that was our first webinar. We did a pretty deep dive in on that. And so I serve as our host. So kind of like we're doing here, having a conversation rather than just a floating head talking at some screens and you guys listening and checking your email or doing your work at the same time. But so we try to make them really engaging and have actual conversations back and forth, engage you guys as an audience, much like Brett is doing today with some poll questions and so on and so forth, and having actual, just conversation, even if it's just in chat. So I'm really excited about our multi-factor authentication webinar with John here. I think a week from today, 2 weeks from today, perhaps.
I think it's a
That's
week.
going to
Yep.
be really interesting because we get a lot of questions around multi-factor authentication and how do you deploy it? What's the best options? Where do you deploy it? What are the risks and the threats and so on and so forth. So we've got a lot of great experience from John, who worked for a managed service provider before coming over here. So he was in the field deploying MFA before switching over to our side of the table. And then I'm even more excited for June, where we're going to be bringing some information security professionals. I originally called it an ISO panel, but it grew beyond that. So we have a banking ISO. We have the president of a credit union who also serves as kind of an information security oversight. We have risk management and controls expert from a large healthcare organization, and I think a risk manager and an auditor from a holding company that has 4 or 5 different organizations under their banner. So really excited to have those folks share and see what questions our audience is going to ask around what's going on in the world of information security at their organization. So
that's awesome. Yeah, that sounds great. And I know that you've got a full calendar for the year. You're very diligent about that, unlike me. So I know that there's a lot of exciting stuff coming up as well. I should have mentioned this right up front, but you can always find information and the ability to register for those on our website. If you'd like to get a copy of the slide deck, we've attached links here as well. So feel free to reach out to me and get that. So let's jump into today's topic. And again, we're just going to start with what is NIST? That's probably the easiest place to begin. So John, I'm going to just kind of start with that question right from the beginning. What is NIST? What are we talking about when we talk about the National Institute for Standards and Technology?
Well, that is exactly who they are, and their name is not all that clever, even though it sounds it makes for a good acronym. But the National Institute of Standards and Technology actually started all the way back in 1901 and up until 1988, I believe, if my memory serves. Let me fact check myself here real quick. That's correct. 1988. They were named the National Bureau of Standards. So obviously, with the advent and mass adoption of the internet, and all of the new technology things that we've done since 1985 or 1988, they added the technology element there as well. So really the main function of NIST, their mission, according to their website and or Wikipedia, is to promote American innovation and industrial competitiveness. What they really do is create best practices for the use of and secure deployment of technologies. So NIST is really well known for a handful of things. They were the first organization to really create standards and guidelines around how to do incident response. Before that, they started building what we would consider a taxonomy or a universe of IT-related security controls, which we would now refer to as cyber controls, but we didn't call them cyber controls all the way back in, 2005 as an example. So NIST 853 is this massive listing of security controls that organizations should consider deploying around their technology. That birthed then the NIST cybersecurity framework, which I believe came out back in the original draft, I think was in 2011, somewhere around that time frame. So, but they put out guidance. Their most recent guidance on the NIST on artificial intelligence is pretty impactful reading. They have standards and guidelines around basically about anything that you can imagine if it is technology related. Again, around the the use of and the secure use of and deployment of technology related products and services. So that's effectively who NIST is. They are actually an agency of the United States Department of Commerce. So it's not like a DoD function specifically or a DOJ function. It's they're tied to the U.S. Department of Commerce, which I thought it was interesting.
Absolutely, and I think it's fascinating that they started that far back, and it's they do everything from weights and measures to time to now technology and cybersecurity frameworks, right?
Yeah, I think their first specific technology guidance was from 1978 or something like that, before we really even had rapid deployment of technology things.
Yeah, absolutely. So knowing that that's what NIST is, that kind of leads to the next question, and you kind of alluded to that as well, is so what's the CSF framework? So around 2011, NIST is charged with coming up with a framework around information and cybersecurity, and what came of that, and what is the framework itself?
So the NIST cybersecurity framework in and of itself is essentially like it sounds, right? It is a framework for good information security at organizations. Now, it was originally developed, the first version of NIST CSF was developed specifically for government agencies. And I'm probably getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but the new version, which we'll discuss more, is much more generic. But that's effectively, in a nutshell, what does good information security look like for a company, an organization, a financial institution, a university, a manufacturing company, what have you, right? So what are the main tenets of good information security, and how do you go from that main idea down to things that you should be doing on your network or on your devices?
So would it be fair to say that anytime anything kind of rises to the level of hey, the government decides we need to find a way to get our arms around this, NIST kind of is tasked with how do we do that? Yeah, I think that happened with the framework here, and I believe they actually just released something on artificial intelligence as well. Kind of the idea being the same thing, right? We got to get our arms around this at some point, and NIST is kind of the starting point for that. Is that fair?
To an extent, right? Mm-hmm. So NIST is really comprised of a whole bunch of scientists. Mm-hmm. So, from my perspective, it is less government mandate than, best practices, right? Okay. So that's really what NIST is a collection of, hey, what are the best practices to do some of these things versus, if you're a federal agency, it's one thing because then you're going to have to comply with NIST CSF. Nobody is required outside of a federal agency to comply with NIST CSF. It's a completely voluntary framework outside of the federal government. So again, it's, how do we put out, what are the best practices around using or securing this thing, whether it's AI, whether it's network architectures, whether it's incident response, whether it's, some other new technology that we haven't talked about yet.
Sure, absolutely. I think that's a great way of putting it too. So I imagine a lot of the people on the call today are probably financial institutions who are regulated by different bodies. How does NIST, the framework, and we'll talk more about maybe what the future looks like, but how does the framework interact with some of regulatory perspective? Is there any, certainly there's probably some overlap to some degree, but is there any interaction there?
As I mentioned, like the only organizations that are required to follow NIST CSF will be federal agencies. So if you're not a federal agency, then NIST is that voluntary thing. However, for our financial institution folks in the audience, most of the regulatory guidance that you will find is either rooted in NIST guidance or mapped to NIST guidance. Just as an example, the FFIEC cybersecurity assessment tool which was released all the way back in 2015, updated in 2017, and has sat there ever since, had 5 levels of what the FFIEC would call cyber maturity, organizational cyber maturity, right? Baseline, evolving, and I can't remember the rest off the top of my head. There's intermediate, advanced, and innovative, I think. It's been a minute since I said those 5 things. Baseline, so there's 123 things that all financial institutions, according to FFIEC CAT, should be doing. And all 123 of those things were mapped to NIST CSF. So you'll see that sprinkled around, throughout FFIEC, FDIC, OCC, Federal Reserve guidance. You'll see it sprinkled around in the FTC safeguards if you're a non-bank financial institution like an insurance company or a trust company. It's crosswalk. You can find a lot of different crosswalks. There are a lot of different frameworks that either map to or are upon the NIST cybersecurity framework. So again, that's, if you see NIST in front of it, there's a good chance that it's going to be really practical, really strong, and based on kind of industry best practices. And when we say industry, not necessarily the industry that you operate in, but the technology industry in and of itself.
Absolutely. And I think that, again, is another nice lead into our next question, is kind of, so why is it so popular? If it's only really mandated for government agencies at this point, why is this something that federal regulatory bodies take from? Why is it so popular, not even really in this country, but globally as well?
Wonderful question. I think it's for one of 2 reasons. It originates here, right? So you've got ISO, which is the International Standards Organization, and 27001 and 27002 as an example. Those are international frameworks. NIST is a US-based framework. So I think that is part of the reason that makes it really popular here. In addition, it's a bit more holistic and encompassing than some of the regulation that we'll see out there today. And it's not, and this is a pro and a con in my perspective, from my perspective, but it is not overly restrictive. It is fairly high level and generic. So that makes it applicable to many different industries, right? Whereas the FFIEC CAT, for example, is very specific. It is very specific to financial institutions. It is very prescriptive. So you get about half of the audience is not necessarily the right term, but half of the implementers of cybersecurity want something that's really prescriptive, right? Like, I really like the FFIEC CAT's model, understanding that it is very outdated, but I appreciate, and a lot of financial institutions appreciate, that here's a specific list of 123 things that we know we need to do, right? If we're not doing those 123 things, we've got to do, if we're doing 120 of them, that means we have 3 specific things that we're doing, versus something like the FFIEC or the NIST cybersecurity framework, where you've got, there's something like 128, no, that's not right, 108, 109 kind of controls, but those controls then map to a whole bunch of other things, so it's a little bit more gray, but at a really high level, it's more simplistic, right? Yeah. So, and it's I believe, again, NIST CSF 1.0 and 1.1 were intended to be used by the federal government and federal government agencies. However, it was adaptable to effectively any organization. Now, we know a lot of financial institutions that have leveraged NIST CSF as either their framework of choice in lieu of the CAT, or have supplemented what they're doing with stuff from NIST CSF. So again, it's a good utility player from that perspective.
Another thing, and this is just from my perspective, feel free to tell me if I'm wrong. I won't hurt my feelings, but it feels accessible to me to some degree. And I think even the 2.0 version, we'll talk a little bit about one of the changes kind of was to, seems like it was to make it more, enhance the scope a little bit and maybe expand a little bit, but people have access to it. It's something that they can find. It's something that, again, it's something that they can actually put to use, even if they're just, a dry cleaner or they're not a financial institution, they're a law firm or something like that, maybe they can grab it and kind of take pieces from. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yes. That's some of that's a little bit of a chicken and an egg type thing, like, is it the most popular because so many people use it, or is it,
so many people use it because
so many people use it because it's popular, right?
Right.
So yes to both. But you're 100% right. Financial institutions and certain other industries have very specific guidance. Healthcare institutions have HIPAA, and you can argue the merits of the security elements of HIPAA, but they still have HIPAA, right? So they have guidance specific to healthcare organizations. Some manufacturers have specific guidance. Some other industries have specific guidance. Banks certainly, financial institutions certainly have specific guidance from their regulatory agency, FDIC, OCC, Federal Reserve, NCUA, and then the FFIEC. So they get bombarded with regulatory guidance. Everybody else doesn't have any of that. So that's where you see a whole lot of folks gravitate towards NIST CSF, is because it is not only the best practice, but a viable entry point for a lot of organizations saying, we don't even really know where to start with doing good security. So let's find a way to do that in a meaningful, measurable way. NIST CSF fits that bill. It's not overly massive. It's not overly complex. It kind of hits that sweet spot of being not too overbearing, but still understandable.
So, and then we're going to get to this when we start talking about some of the changes, but I think in doing some research for this topic, it sounds like a lot of people are harping on the expansion of the scope a little bit of the framework and kind of even some of the softening of the language a little bit. I guess my question would be twofold here for you. One, do you kind of agree with that take that it has been expanded and maybe softened a little bit to make it a little more accessible even? And then if so, what do you think the intent of that was?
Yes and no. I mean, this is always, especially when something gets opened up for public comment, to try to move that bar forward to make sure organizations, especially in critical infrastructure, do good security things, because not only is their organization and their customers' reputations and confidential data at stake, it's critical infrastructure for a reason, and we've seen significant attacks from foreign actors, nation state, hacking groups, so on and so forth, even just recently on water, on transportation, on ag. There's a big story about some big farms, tractors getting shut down over the internet. There's been stories around, water in counties getting polluted or contaminated because of, online connected things. So there's that fine balance between moving the bar forward on a macro scale from cybersecurity and what an organization's responsibility, and by responsibility, we mean both resources and dollars, can bear, right? So some of that is just macro thoughts from a guy that's done security of this world for 20 years, and some of you in the audience have as well. That bar is constantly moving because the threat landscape is constantly moving. So how do we keep up with that while not trying to overburden stuff and dealing with, regulatory best practices, whether it's NIST or FFIEC or, name your other, HIPAA. Before the CSF was recently updated here a few months ago, it'd been 10 years. Mm-hmm. The CAT is nearly 10 years old. It will be next year. HIPAA is over 10 years old. So nothing really happens real fast in the world of cybersecurity best practice and regulatory guidance at that level. So oftentimes when you have such a gap, the bar gets raised more than if that bar would be raised up a little bit and stair-stepped,
Sure.
a couple times throughout those 10 years. So if you read some of the comments, there's always organizations that are talking about how it's going to create undue burden on the organization to do this, that, and the other thing, and you're always going to get that. So if you carve some of that out, and which I get and I understand, we're a small business, we know what the changing landscape means from employees, from a talent perspective, from implementing our own cybersecurity controls and running our organization looks like too. So I get it. But if you don't raise that bar, then the bottom end of the spectrum, the folks that don't want the change are never going to come along and get to that level of maturity. So as far as softening of language, there's not a ton that I necessarily spend a lot of time with that I would consider much more soft.
Okay.
I would consider it more broad from that perspective because, and you might have some good examples and I'm happy to discuss them, but from that perspective, technology is more broad. We're more in on technology as a critical business function today. So some of that comes with things like multi-factor authentication, implemented everywhere, as opposed to real specific instances that we would see 10 years ago of, as an example, the FFIEC saying, hey, you need to consider multi-factor authentication for your online banking platforms if X, Y, Z, right? So so that's kind of macro some of the things that I've seen, but I'd love to hear your feedback as well, Brett.
No, and maybe softening was the wrong word, and I think that probably was the case. Maybe just offering a little more clarity and maybe not being as complex, I guess, is maybe just in some of the reading that I've done. But again, it just seems like, maybe this is a better way to rephrase the question. So the first one was built more specifically for the government because that's who was meant to comply with it. Do you feel like the second version, maybe the language is expanded to, again, not to make it mandatory for everybody else, but to be more inclusive, maybe?
I think that's a good take, from that perspective, because 60 to 70% of organizations that are going to be leveraging the NIST CSF are probably not under any sort of compliance related mandate, right, for NIST CSF. So that probably goes back into the how do we make it more accessible? How do we make it less complex? How do we make sure that folks can understand what we're doing? Because not everybody's going to get audited or assessed or regulated or, held accountable for their NIST CSF compliance. So I think that's a good take.
Cool. All right, so let's start talking a little bit about what the biggest changes were. Now, I give you this slide with the idea being, I think we're leading into the idea of that additional governance function piece, I think. So we'll kind of go there in a second. But you mentioned that this came out 10 years after the original release. So it's been a little while. I know it was in draft form for, I think, a year or two, probably. What do you think was so important that NIST decided, okay, we need to update it now? Was there anything that was driving that in particular?
Just the changes in the technology landscape over the last 10 years. I mean, 10 years is forever, right? In the world of, I don't know whether that is in dog years, 70 years in dog years. Is that right? Like, is it 1 year is 7 years? So it's kind of the same thing in the world of technology, right? It's 10 years is forever. Yeah. Think of the way that we operated our organizations technology wise 10 years ago, right? We were really just getting into virtualization, figuring stuff out. That was really before the advent of Microsoft 365 and in today's mass transition to cloud computing, as an example. So the technology landscape in and of itself, consumer use of technology. You know, how many IoT devices did you have in your home 10 years ago, Brett?
Not as many as I have today, I promise.
Right? You know, the number, I don't even want to say how many I have
Yeah,
because it's probably
same here.
embarrassing, but it's a lot.
Yeah.
And so, you know, automobiles are another good example. You know, if you purchase a car that's 10 years old, you might be able to connect via Bluetooth to some things, but it's not connected the way that things are today. So just the world and the use of technology as we've evolved over the last 10 years has changed really significantly. So that's, in my opinion, the biggest driver, because we didn't have good guidance around that stuff 10 years ago. We didn't talk about the cloud like we do today 10 years ago. It was a thought, it was an idea. It's like quantum computing, right? We know quantum computing is coming. It's still a few years away from being practical, but it's coming, right? That's kind of where cloud computing was in the 2010 to 2014 timeframe. IoT devices were kind of on the brink of really being massively adopted. Virtualization was the big thing. So some of even NIST CSF missed the boat on all of that stuff completely. So that's really, in my opinion, the big driver and the big need to have more updated guidance is there's stuff out there about how to do some of these things, but not in, you know, any framework that hasn't been updated in the last few years.
Are you surprised it takes so long, or it took 10 years to do this?
Well, we were just lamenting how old the FFIEC is. So no, not really. They're really deliberate, and I have some insight into what that looks like on the world of the FFIEC, because I know a handful of regulators that serve on, you know, those guidance committees, and understanding how long that takes just to get some minor changes resolved, much less completely redoing a major piece of massively adopted guidance. But to that same extent, you know, if it was every 5 years instead of every 10 years, that would certainly be a whole lot better. But no, on the macro, not really surprised, just knowing kind of how the sausage is made, you know, behind the scenes.
And I guess they did start, you know, soliciting, you know, feedback, and they had some drafts, I think, last year, if I'm not mistaken. So I guess it's something they've been working on. They weren't just sitting on their hands, hopefully, right? So
yeah, I think their very first public comment around a new CSF update was 2001 timeframe. So it's been in the works for a long time, but it just takes that long to get everybody as close to on the same page as they can get them before turning it over.
So probably, I don't know if you would say this is the biggest change. It's certainly the flashiest one. Absolutely. Because they had to update their little wheel there. But obviously they introduced governance, or govern, as one of the key functions of the framework. So I guess maybe start off with, I don't know, maybe if you want to give a quick, you know, idea of what each of those pieces on the wheel are, and then maybe what the govern piece is. I don't know. I'll turn it over to you there.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're 1,000% right. And the govern function, which is far and away the most impactful, important, and biggest change to NIST CSF from version 1.1, and for very good reason, right? So a couple big key takeaways here. Number one is NIST CSF in and of itself was good. We still talk about this process from how to build and manage an information security program, regardless of any organization, right? You have to be able to identify what the major threats and attack vectors are today. You have to be able to protect your organization from those major attack vectors. You have to be able to detect, which is a very underrated element of NIST CSF. And if you've ever heard us talk, over the last few years, you've probably heard us say it is just important today, maybe even more important, to be able to detect when something bad is happening in your environment than it is to focus solely on protect, right? Because bad things are going to happen, and you have to be able to detect when they occur. Then you have to respond to whatever bad thing has happened, and then you have to recover and restore business operations. So from an information security development and lifecycle perspective, we use this all the time. The one element that was really missing, because again, it was really developed for federal agencies in the first place, was that govern function. So the deployment or the inclusion of this govern function, in my opinion, really for the first time opens up NIST CSF to be truly industry agnostic, because that was something that was definitely missing. Why a lot of financial institutions only leverage pieces or parts of CSF, because in most regulated industries, you're required to have a formal written information security program, whether you fall under the banner of the FCC, the FTC, so on and so forth, HIPAA, right? All of those standards and frameworks will require you to have some variation of what we would call an information security program. So the govern function of NIST CSF really adds that element in and much more closely aligns their cybersecurity framework with other regulated industries, and really well aligns with the financial sector. So that's why it's such a big, massive, important thing from my perspective. Also, just as a quick note, I was looking for a breakdown, and I can't find it quickly. I probably should ask the robots. But the govern function not only is the latest addition, but it is also now has the most elements, whether they're subcategories or categories or subcategories, because we got functions, categories, subcategories. So, but it has the most stuff in it from all of NIST. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that got moved and rearranged because there was some tangential stuff to governance in CSF 1.1, but now it lives in this govern section. There's some new stuff. There's some reorganized and rearranged stuff, but it is the biggest section of NIST CSF.
Yeah, and that kind of leads, one of the next questions I was going to pose is like, why did this not make the cut in the first one? But I think you hit the nail on the head, it sounds like, is it kind of was, there was some governance pieces kind of spread out, not necessarily to the level it is now. And they just kind of finally pulled it all together and basically said, this is a critically important function as well. Is that kind of the way you're reading it?
Yeah, it reiterates the message of you've got to have good strategy around cybersecurity, right? You can't just take a handful of controls and throw them at your devices and your networks and say, yeah, we got a cybersecurity program, right? I mean, it's more than just making decisions around what security controls to deploy. How do you make those decisions? How do you know if they're the right decisions? So that's where the govern element function comes into play. Is when we talk about governance, right? It's more than just policies and procedures, which is an important area, but it's also roles and responsibilities, it's risk management, it's training and education. It's all of that upfront prep stuff that you got to do before you just go out and do security stuff, right? How do you train your users? How do you train your subject matter experts? How do you train your board of directors or your senior managers? How do you train your customers? No, not all of that stuff is spelled out in NIST CSF as an example, but training and education, roles and responsibilities, risk management. I believe, I'm double checking here, that there's a supply chain management. Is that that's in the govern section, right?
Sure,
so NIST CSF 1.1 didn't talk about vendor management. Now we've got a major other governance type function around vendor management or supply chain risk management in CSF. So it's basically incorporating all of the things that we know we need to do to have a good information security program up front. And if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Right. That's a business saying as old as time. Same goes for cybersecurity risk management. If you can't really measure your risk and use those metrics to help you make good empowered cybersecurity decisions, then you're just checking a box.
Sure. So if that was the biggest change, certainly there were some other ones. We've talked about some of these already, but maybe I'll allow you to, or ask you to pick a couple of these out. But we talk about, maybe expanded the scope in terms of trying to be more inclusive, some clarity adjustments, focusing on some more of those emerging threats, particularly since the last one came out so long ago. Any of these stand out on the screen in terms of, that's something that, might not have gotten as much publicity, but we think is a big change?
Well, probably not a whole lot else to add, because I talk a lot and probably cover, some of these things previously. But, in terms of expanded scope, we talked about those technology changes, right? Mm. Concepts that were relatively obscure or not even really didn't really exist or weren't widely adopted back in 2014, such as the aforementioned cloud computing. Another thing that we talk about a lot is zero trust, right? So zero trust is discussed a handful of times throughout NIST CSF. Mobile devices, we didn't talk a ton about mobile devices back in 2014, but there's a bigger focus there now. Internet of Things we discussed as well. We just talked about cybersecurity, supply chain risk management. Platform security is kind of another new interesting topic around, how are you leveraging your architectures and your platforms, and how are you doing good security around there? So those are kind of the big list of things that I talk about when we talk about the big changes around NIST CSF. Privacy and cybersecurity are definitely merging a little bit more, cross-pollinating a little bit more, if you will. I think that there's still a big barrier between the two things from that perspective, just from a macro picture, right? Because there are the cybersecurity stuff that you have to worry about is your stuff and and the vendors that you use. Privacy, but cybersecurity effectively looks inside to say, hey, all of this stuff is mine, right? Mm-hmm. And it's my job, my responsibility as an organization to make sure it's protected no matter where it is, no matter where it's being stored, transmitted, and processed. Privacy, it has this interesting dichotomy between I, as an organization, have collected this data from customers, and it is my responsibility to not just protect it from a cyber perspective, but to use it appropriately, right? And, so how do I use it appropriately? And how do I let customers know how I'm using their information? Whereas the opposite end of that spectrum is the information actually belongs legally to the customer. Mm-hmm. So the customer also has a right to say, here's how I want you to use my data. So it's not just the business saying, here's how I'm going to use your data. The customer also says, I don't want you to use my data that way. I don't want to be a customer anymore. I want you to give me my data back and delete it, right? So they're similar things in terms of the protection, but they're different things in terms of the use. But those topics are becoming much more intertwined. So it's a really interesting time. Cybersecurity, privacy is probably where cybersecurity was 10 years ago in terms of its business importance. Not from hey, we've got a privacy policy and we're doing the right things, but in terms of how it's viewed and how it's regulated. Sure.
Do you think that wall needs to exist between those two, or are you hoping that it does merge a little bit more?
I don't have a good answer for that one right at this moment. I mean, sure. it in terms of cybersecurity and privacy being separate things. Yeah. Again, the macro objectives of what we do as businesses around cybersecurity and around privacy are different. Mm-hmm. So I think that there will always be a barrier or a gap between those two things. I don't think because in my opinion, they're not the same thing. Right. Yeah, because of how the customer interacts with their data versus the protection of the organization, customer information, employees, so on and so forth. So I don't know. I haven't spent a ton of time thinking about kind of should there be a barrier from a cyber, because that really means you've got somebody doing both things. And at a lot of organizations, there's somebody doing a whole lot more than just those two things, right?
Yeah.
Especially smaller organizations.
Sure.
But as privacy becomes more regulated, I think it's just going to create new roles, new job opportunities, good, bad, or otherwise. And but I think that there will continue to be that gap. And I don't know that I would say anything other than I think that they are, since they are different functions, sort of like we have a separation between information technology and information security or cyber security, because they serve two different purposes. I would foresee that barrier sticking around, and rightfully so.
Well, as usual, you're much more introspective than I am. I just, my biggest takeaways were it did seem like it was more industry agnostic, which, the framework as a whole, which I think ideally will be helpful going forward for a variety of industries, including financial services. And then I did think the supply chain management / vendor management stuff stuck out in terms of
absolutely
being addressed.
And keep your questions coming and your comments coming in the chat too, please. Todd and Nanette, we're getting to yours. Sorry, we haven't addressed them yet, but we're getting to them, I promise.
Yes. And if not, I'll make sure we get them addressed at the end. Unfortunately, I can't see them at the same time here right now. But all right, so this is probably a big question for a lot of the folks that are on the call. If I am a financial institution, how will that impact us? So a lot of our attendees are, governed by different regulations and things like that. What do you foresee the changes to the CSF? What kind of impact, if at all, do you see it having?
And this is exactly what Todd and Nanette were chatting about in the comments. So right now, today, there is, unless you are leveraging this CSF as your framework of choice, then there is no impact as of right now. However, as we mentioned earlier, the FFIEC CAT is based on at least the baseline declarative statements or controls in FFIEC CAT are all mapped to NIST CSF 1.1. My prediction, so getting in my crystal ball here a little bit, and knowing some regulators, we know that the FFIEC CAT is being debated as to what to do with the CAT. So I don't have an answer for you, but I do know that it is being worked on, and it has probably been being worked on for the last 4 or 5 years. Some of this stuff just takes a long time, unfortunately. And a couple contacts that I know kind of flip-flop back and forth between they're going to do away with the CAT completely, or they're going to update the CAT to 2.0. If I had to look into my crystal ball, I think that one of two things will happen. And the less likely, in my perspective, is that the FFIEC does away with the FFIEC CAT and says use NIST CSF. I think that's on the table, but I think it's less likely than what's behind door number 2, which is the FFIEC CAT is updated and remapped and expanded to align with CSF 2.0, and all of those baseline controls are then directly mapped to NIST CSF 2.0. So in terms of likelihood, those are kind of my two things. I think those are really the two elements. I think that FFIEC does away with the CAT. That just it starts to feel like the FFIEC just pushes everybody towards other best practices and maybe starts feeling less relevant. Unsure, but that's why I think that the FFIEC CAT is more likely to get updated than the FFIEC just say, go use NIST CSF 2.0. Now, a lot of organizations that we know and work with on some level over webinars that we've done in the past, at least half, if not 65%, are leveraging this CSF at some juncture. Now, most of those in in terms are specific to, well, in so much that, the stuff that we do is mapped to NIST CSF.
Yeah.
But so on the macro, 45% of organizations are leveraging NIST CSF at some juncture beyond just the FFIEC CAT. So long term, there will be more impact. Immediately, there is no impact unless you are leveraging CSF as your framework of choice. You have if you're using CSF as a supplement, then you obviously aren't necessarily tied to anything unless you're not using FFIEC CAT and you're leveraging CSF, then you're going to have to probably make some of these changes sooner rather than later in advance of your next exam. So time frame, I know Todd asked about time frame. I don't have a good time frame for you. I would expect some update, hopefully by the end of this year, not like a deliverable, but an update as to from the FFIEC where they're going. I do know that the FFIEC is actively working on revamping some of their other guidance, similar to how they had the joint statement put out last fall, November, I think it was, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the IT management and IS booklets are getting some updates. Again, I wouldn't expect to see those before the end of this year, if not well into next year, but some updates on the way from that perspective.
Thank you for asking those questions, folks. Again, I apologize, I can't see them just yet, but
we got some good ones coming in.
Some of them addressed. So,
John, just to address Carolyn,
yep,
we absolutely will be doing that, Carolyn, 100%. We had another question from Chris that we'll talk about in terms of data breach notifications. So we'll hold on to that one real quick.
So yeah, and I do want to make sure we get time to talk about some of the new stuff we've got too. So maybe just quickly, do you believe that the new CSF, if you're a non-financial institution, is it still a viable option and maybe potentially the better option to follow?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a reason that it's the most popular, for the reasons that we talked about earlier. So if you're a non-financial institution and aren't specifically regulated, I would certainly look at CSF as a way to start deploying a cyber framework at your organization. Again, if you're not being audited, assessed, examined, or anything of that nature on cybersecurity, it's a great way to start, and you can start deploying things logically and over time. But having a good framework to work from is much better than not. You wouldn't build a house without a blueprint.
Right.
I would not recommend doing cybersecurity stuff for your business if you don't have a roadmap or a framework.
And we talk a lot as a company about being proactive, right? And it's just an opportunity to have some guidance in how to be proactive if you're not being, audited, examined, anything like that. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
We've talked a little bit about the future already. John, I'll just kind of give you an opening here. Are there any other updates that you'd like to see to the CSF in the future, or do you see anything? Obviously it took quite a while to get where we are, standing here this moment, but anything that you see as a gap that maybe you'd like to see them close?
I would like to see the CSF have some element of measurability to it in the future. If you're asking me, I think the framework, the controls all align with the things that we believe to be good security things here at SBS. I would just like a better way to measure outside of doing some gap analysis and understanding how close we were. So I know that there are some implementation guides and some profiles, but it's still really subjective as opposed to, the flip side of that is the FFIEC CAT, which is really prescriptive,
right?
And you know exactly what you need to do next if you're not doing the thing. So that's my only qualm about CSF.
So maybe a middle ground somewhere for folks. Yeah. All right. So I want to open this. This is something that we're rolling out. We're very excited about. So for those of you who are using NIST as your framework or even have adopted elements of it. John, we're rolling out what we call our NIST Cybersecurity Framework Assessment, which is kind of a wordy, and I think you have some, maybe you can break it down and tell people a little bit more about maybe what this actually is and what we're trying to do with it. So I'll turn the floor over to you because you developed this, or were instrumental anyway in developing it.
Well, I don't know that I'm instrumental to a whole lot of things, but I get a bunch of smart people in a room, and then we come up with some good ideas that they have more than me. But yeah, the idea around our NIST Cybersecurity Framework Assessment, or NIST CSF Assessment, is to really assess, and notice that we're not using the term audit, right? But assess how you are doing in terms of your organization's deployment of NIST CSF. So looking through now the 6 different functions, the categories, the subcategories, breaking that stuff down, helping you understand what it means, what it's mapped to, so what's the intent behind that thing, and where you're at with your deployment and implementation of CSF. So again, it's meant to help you understand what you're doing well, what you're not doing well, what gaps you have, and kind of bring you a little bit of a roadmap or a plan to address and be a little bit more compliant. Isn't necessarily the right term, but adherent maybe is a good term to NIST CSF.
And I think kind of what, correct me if I'm wrong again, but what seems like why we're rolling this out as a new offering is we're kind of, if we're just doing an IT audit on somebody who's using the NIST cybersecurity framework, that should work to some extent as well, but it is to some degree as it's a different framework, right? It's something that's very, specific in terms of what it's trying to accomplish. And the idea being with this offering that we can take the actual assessment and see how you're doing compared to that. Seems like it would give people a pretty good understanding of what the gaps are in their program. Is that fair?
Absolutely. So, the folks that this would benefit are if you are leveraging NIST CSF as your primary cyber framework, as opposed to FFIEC guidance or the CAT as an example, or if you're interested in going that route, this would be a good service for you. Or if you're a non-regulated organization that follows NIST CSF and you want to see where you're at with how you match up there, again, good things to understand.
And I know we also, in addition to the framework assessment that we're rolling out, we are also making some, or I guess I should say, offering a virtual CISO that has more of a NIST framework approach. Is that how you would kind of term that?
Absolutely.
So for any company that's out there that's listening to this, or even if you are a financial institution and one of your customers is looking for help or something like that, that virtual CISO offering would help them, more specifically with NIST than just kind of, hey, we're coming in with a different framework entirely.
Yeah, again, it's really just a slightly different focus on the upfront planning and prep stuff from that perspective.
Sure.
Same processes, same expertise, same amazing consultants. Just a little bit of a different flavor to say, hey, CSF is the thing that we align to, not FFIEC or HIPAA or insert other thing here. So yeah, it's a NIST flavored virtual CISO.
I like that. All right, so I am going to check and see, and maybe John, actually, you're probably in a better position than I am to see if there's any questions that came in that we haven't addressed, but just quickly on some takeaways. NIST obviously has a very critical purpose in promoting innovation in industrial competitiveness. So that's a little bit about who they are. We've got the updated framework. We talked about the recent changes that came out, but probably the biggest one being that governance as a core function. And then, just that if you are building an information security program and NIST is the framework for that, having an assessment, having those consultants that can deal more specifically with that can really help you make your organization a lot more secure and really understand where the gaps are. And then certainly we do offer some assistance with that as well. So, John, I don't know, can you see if any other questions came in? I apologize for tasking you with that, but I can't pull my screen down just
No,
yet.
no, absolutely. Yep. We think we've hit on all of them. So if you guys have additional questions, drop them in the chat now and we'll stick around and answer. But we do have one that I wanted to get to from
Please.
Chris, who asked, who governs our obligation to share information about a cybersecurity breach? Is federal government, but what about SMEs, state laws? So banks for federal governments, but what about SMEs? So again, and I know somebody responded there. So there's two things, and this is becoming increasingly complex, Chris. So I totally get the question. So there's two elements to consider here. There is customer notifications, and then there's agency notifications, we'll call it, right? So if you're not a financial institution, which would be governed by, the Federal Reserve or FDIC, OCC, NCUA, but you are tangential and would be considered a financial institution, then the FTC has their own incident notification handling procedures, which requires you to notify the FTC of any sort of material breach or incident. The SEC has their own stuff. CISA, which is the federal government's, CISA agency, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, is coming out with CERCIA, which is their incident notification reporting thing. So we're actively working on a blog post to answer that question very succinctly. And, so you say, okay, well, here's who I am, right? But again, if you're unregulated organization, Main Street business, so on and so forth, you might fall under some requirements depending on who you are and what you do. My wife has a floral shop, right? So she doesn't fall under any of that. If she has an incident there, she'd have to check PCI to make sure that, there's no cardholder data that, like a Target that was compromised, but there wouldn't be anybody, maybe the state of South Dakota, I would suppose that she would have to notify, but the other individual said that said unknown user, otherwise I'd credit them, but they said, be sure to check with your attorney, which is what we would caveat all of the time too. But so if you have any questions on that, Chris, if you are in a specific industry and you think that there might be reporting requirements, please reach out. We'll be happy to have a conversation with you. But if you're not in a regulated organization, healthcare, basically critical infrastructure, then you might not have specific notifications other than customer notifications if customer data was compromised.
Excellent. Well, I know we're just a minute over here. I meant to mention this earlier. I am going to launch some polls here as you guys are departing. Any feedback that you can provide here would be really helpful. So please take a look at those. John, can't thank you enough for your time today. You're awesome as always. I'm going to put our contact information back up here and I'll leave this up for a little bit. So if anybody wants to reach out to us directly, you want copies of the slides, you want a copy of the recording, feel free to reach out to us directly. But with that said, really appreciate your time today. Hopefully we'll see you on some of those Institute webinars coming up, and love to see you on the Cyber Showcase again next month. So John, thanks again. And thanks everybody for attending.
Absolutely. Thanks for the great questions, guys. Much appreciated. See you next time.